This is the story of Grace, a young woman in her 20s, who leaves her bustling city life to study in an unfamiliar American town. She meets a Methodist pastor, a man devoted to everyone yet nursing a hidden sorrow, and they fall in love. Before we dive into the story, please hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. It really helps our channel. When Grace arrived at the bus station in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a chill in the air wrapped around her, a stark reminder of her new surroundings. It was a world away from the bustling metropolis of Chicago. The buildings were lower, the pace of life unhurried, yet a sense of unknown excitement began to bubble within her. Grace had come to this city for a fresh start as a university student. She had come to major in music, specifically piano. Though she'd nearly completed her associate's degree back home, she longed for deeper learning and a chance to discover her unique musical voice, which brought her to this different part of the country. The first challenges to greet her were the subtle cultural shifts and the pangs of homesickness. Even though she spoke the same language, navigating a new social landscape and finding her footing was a different challenge altogether. She desperately needed something, or someone, to help her open up and find a sense of stability. As time went on, Grace gradually adapted to life there. Other students who had also moved from out of state and her classmates offered small, everyday tips, and she even found a studio near the university where she could rent a piano and practice. Yet, a void remained in her heart. She longed for a trustworthy community. Back in Chicago, when she attended church with her family, familiar faces would greet her warmly every Sunday. In this new town, finding such a safety net wasn't as easy as she'd hoped. Then one day, a small flyer on the music department's bulletin board caught her eye. It read, "Cedar Rapids Community Methodist Church, choir accompanist wanted." Professor Evans, one of her instructors, had also mentioned that a local church was looking for an accompanist and suggested she try out. Grace thought it would be a good way to earn some pocket money and, by meeting church members, she might find a warmer atmosphere to settle into. When she called the number on the flyer, a kind male voice answered. Hello, are you calling about the accompanist position? I'm Daniel Anderson, the pastor of the Cedar Rapids Community Methodist Church. His voice, strangely, offered immediate comfort. It sounded mature, yet tinged with vitality. After Grace introduced herself, Pastor Daniel Anderson kindly asked about her situation and warmly welcomed her. "That's wonderful. How about coming to our Sunday afternoon service this week? Our church isn't large, but we're like family. We certainly need an accompanist. And if it's not too much of a burden, we'd love for you to join us." Grace let out a sigh of relief, feeling as if she had just met a connection she had been waiting for. On her first day at the church, Grace met several people, but Pastor Daniel Anderson's gentle and sincere demeanor stood out. When Grace shyly introduced herself, he was the first to express gratitude, saying, "We're the ones who are grateful. Thank you so much for offering to play for us." He also thoughtfully showed her around, pointing out the church rooms, the piano's location, and how to set up the sound equipment, careful not to make her feel overwhelmed. As time passed, Grace diligently played the piano for Sunday services, Wednesday evening services, and Friday prayer meetings. The pastor always praised her, saying her playing was like a key that unlocked people's hearts. Grace gradually grew closer to the church members, sharing meals with them during tough times and finding genuine connection during worship was a great comfort. However, Grace's gaze soon began to linger on Pastor Daniel more and more. Some days, it was the sight of him organizing messy books in the church, fixing a broken fan in his spare moments, or catching a child who had run off. Other days, it was seeing him pray alone in the chapel late at night, mulling over the stories of his congregants. These moments left a profound impression on her. "Pastor, you're truly amazing," she once said. "How can you always smile?" "Not at all," he replied. "Actually, I have many moments when I'm tired and weary. But if I can be a source of strength to someone, I just want to do my given role a little better." In his words, Grace felt a human warmth. At first, it was just admiration, she thought, He must be a man of deep faith who truly loves people. She naturally assumed he was happily married. However, she later learned from an elderly church member that he carried the painful memory of bereavement. Our pastor's wife passed away from a sudden illness when he was younger. He's dedicated his whole life to ministry since then. Without remarrying, Grace began to glimpse the hidden wound behind the pastor's deep gaze. After that, whenever she saw him, her heart ached for reasons she couldn't quite understand. Cedar Rapids usually boasted calm weather, but occasionally, fierce storms would roll in, and winter could bring blizzards. One early summer, the weather forecast warned of a high possibility of a major tornado, and city officials and the media urged all residents to prepare for evacuation. The church also had to prepare for the emergency, reinforcing windows with protective coverings, packing emergency supplies, and setting up a temporary shelter in the basement. Grace wanted to help, but her school schedule made it difficult to participate fully. Then, the forecasted tornado actually formed. Grace had briefly stopped by the church to pick up some sheet music and was caught off guard by the tornado's unexpectedly rapid approach. Outside, the wind was already whipping ferociously, making it impossible to go out onto the roads. Alone in the church, after closing doors and checking windows, Grace trembled as the sound of the wind grew louder. When she finally got a phone signal, she called Pastor Daniel. "Pastor, I came to the church to get some sheet music, but the wind is too strong now. I can't leave." "What? Oh no, stay right there. I'll be there right away. Make sure the windows and doors are securely locked." Pastor Daniel had already finished his own evacuation preparations. But upon hearing Grace was at the church, he immediately drove his truck back. When he arrived, battling through the torrential rain, the church's main door was shaking as if it would break. He jumped out of his truck, quickly found Grace, and led her to the basement. The sound of thunder assaulted their ears, and the wind seemed to shake the entire church. Fortunately, the tornado that hit Cedar Rapids only grazed the area near the church, causing no major damage. However, the tension lingered. To find a safe place to stay, the pastor suggested to Grace, "It's still unstable outside. My house is close to the church, so let's move quickly while there's a lull. It's too dangerous to try and go back to your dorm now." The pastor's house was only a few minutes' drive from the church. Grace couldn't refuse his offer. The wind and rain outside were terrifying, and the roads to her dormitory might be blocked. The thought, "It's a house, so he probably has a family, and I'd be an inconvenience in a stranger's home," flickered through her mind. But the pastor's next words put her at ease. "I live alone. I don't have family, so please, don't feel uncomfortable." Pastor Daniel's house was an older American-style home with a moderately sized yard, trees, and a small flower bed. Stepping inside, she saw a cozy but tidy living room, a bookshelf, and a piano. She briefly wondered if he, too, had majored in music, but later learned the piano had belonged to his late wife. Sitting on the living room sofa, Grace felt uncomfortable in her wet clothes. The pastor handed her a warm towel and some spare clothes, smiling wistfully as he said, "If I'd raised a daughter, she'd be about this age now." Hearing this, Grace wondered if he had lost a child in addition to his wife, and she cautiously asked, "I'm sorry, I don't know if I should ask, but the daughter you mentioned." "Oh, no, it was just me talking to myself. Actually, I never had children. Life changed so much after my wife passed away from her illness." He said it calmly, as if recalling something from a distant past. Yet, beneath his serene expression lay a deep sorrow. As time passed, the fierce winds gradually subsided. The news continued to report that although the tornado had passed, people should prepare for secondary damage. The pastor suggested it would be best if she stayed at his house until morning. Grace had no other options. So that night, thanks to the pastor's kindness, she was able to sleep safely. Around midnight, Grace woke to the sound of the wind. Seeing a faint light seeping from the living room, she cautiously opened her door. Pastor Daniel was sitting at a desk, with a Bible and other books spread before him. Normally, Grace would have just returned to her room, but this time, She mustered the courage to approach him. "Can't sleep. The wind is still pretty strong out there." "Grace, you're awake too. I just have a lot on my mind. I'm so thankful the church is safe today." They sat facing each other at a small table, sharing tea. They started by talking about the tornado and the weather. Then naturally, the conversation drifted to Grace's story, why she pursued music, why she came all the way to Iowa, and her anxieties about her future career path. The pastor offered her advice. "Being a musician is truly remarkable. It's similar to faith, isn't it? It moves people, comforts them, and sometimes, it can reach deep into the hearts of strangers. Thank you for thinking so. I still have a long way to go, but I hope someday my music can be a source of strength to someone." What began as a light conversation deepened as the early morning hours wore on, and they slowly opened up to each other. Grace spoke of her anxieties about leaving home and how she tried to gather herself amidst a daily life filled with mixed expectations and fears here. Pastor Daniel gently encouraged her, while also carefully sharing his own past, where life hadn't always gone as planned. "Everyone carries scars. I live with mine, but I find that it helps me see the scars in others too." Grace's eyes welled up at his words. She felt her respect for him growing. Pastor Daniel wasn't just trying to hide his pain, he was striving to give greater love to others through that pain. She found his strength incredibly beautiful. The next morning, the sky was clear, and the menacing tornado was long gone. However, traces of its passage, fallen trees and downed power lines, scarred parts of Cedar Rapids. The church hadn't suffered complete destruction, but a few windows were broken, and part of the roof was damaged, requiring repairs. Grace got a ride back to her dorm with the pastor. Looking out the window at the damage, a wave of anxiety washed over her again, wondering what might have happened if it had been just a little worse. At the same time, she was grateful for the pastor's decisiveness and responsibility during the crisis. If it weren't for him, she might have been seriously injured in the church. Even after returning to her dorm, images of Pastor Daniel kept replaying in her mind, his warm arm protecting her, the smile he offered despite his tired face, and their conversation in the early morning. What began as mere religious admiration was now something different. Her heart pounded with an inexplicable excitement, racing wildly. From then on, whenever she went to church, Grace observed the pastor more intently. He still treated everyone with an unfailing kindness, sharing meals with congregants weary from life's struggles, volunteering for cleaning duties, and always opening his door to anyone who sought conversation. He wasn't singling her out or treating her specially. He was equally considerate to everyone, always wearing an unclouded smile. Nevertheless, Grace no longer felt moved by him solely because he was the pastor. A feeling beyond pure respect began to bloom. She wanted to love this man. At first, Grace herself was taken aback. "A pastor, and I'm only in my early to mid-20s. How old is he?" After a few conversations, she gathered he was at least 20 years older than her. Moreover, as a pastor, he would naturally be extremely cautious about developing private feelings for a congregant. But feelings aren't easily suppressed. Grace hadn't often experienced romantic feelings for anyone, but this kind of emotional stirring and heart-pounding was new to her. Perhaps because he was a man who had disciplined himself, believing he had to be a pastor. His human warmth, his scars, and his sense of responsibility resonated even more deeply with her. Around the time the church repairs were mostly finished and daily life was returning to normal, Grace looked for any small opportunity to talk with the pastor. Of course, in official settings, she remained professional in her role as accompanist. But on Sunday late afternoons, after other congregants had left, if she happened to encounter him in the church's backyard or a similar quiet spot, she would courageously strike up a conversation. The pastor, too, treated Grace comfortably, but he began to notice a change in her gaze. There was something cautious yet earnest in her voice, and he sensed that an irreversible emotion might be taking root. So, one day, he quietly called Grace aside and spoke to her, politely but firmly. "Grace, if I'm making you uncomfortable, Please tell me beforehand. My intention is simply to look after you as a pastor. I have no other meaning at all. I know, Pastor. I know what kind of person you are. That's why I'm even more grateful to you. And I like you." As her last words came out, the pastor's face momentarily stiffened. Grace blushed. In the sudden silence, the pastor slightly shook his head and replied in a soft but clear tone. "Thank you, but I can't. My position, my age, and most importantly, the past where I lost my wife. I'm not even sure I deserve to feel such emotions again." Tears threatened to spill, but Grace fought them back, trying to understand his position. She loved him, but she couldn't ignore his scars and the practical problems. Grace nodded and left the church. Her heart ached, and she couldn't sleep at all that night. However, less than a week later, Grace made a decision. If I can't give up this feeling, I at least have to express it honestly. That way, I won't have regrets. So, she poured her heart into a small letter. It was devoid of flowery language but deeply sincere. "Pastor, I understand well why you are trying to refuse my feelings. Still, I wanted to tell you what kind of person you are to me. How much I respect and love you. I'm still young, and I sometimes doubt if my feelings might waver. But this time, I am sure, as a pastor, you must have pain you wish to avoid and responsibilities you must uphold. Nevertheless, I love you deeply. It's hard to deny this feeling. I hope that someday, after reading my letter, you will understand even a little of my sincerity." Grace placed the handwritten letter in an envelope and discreetly left it on the desk in the pastor's study inside the church building. Then, she waited. As the days passed without a response, Grace grew more anxious. Then one day, she received a text message from the pastor. "Grace, can you come to the church chapel for a moment this evening? There's something I need to tell you." Her heart pounded. Her hands trembled all the way to the church. When Grace opened the door, the chapel was dark and quiet. Only the cross at the front glowed with a soft light. Pastor Daniel was sitting near the altar, his head bowed as if in thought. As Grace approached, he looked up and smiled faintly. "I received your letter. Thank you for your honesty. I'm just sorry. I wonder if I've made things harder for you, Pastor." The pastor shook his head, his eyes showing he had already made some kind of decision. "Far from making it harder. I was actually happy, but it's still not easy to come to a conclusion. As a pastor, as an older man, I always hesitate. Can I dare to accept this?" Grace slowly walked towards the piano on the left side of the chapel. Spreading out the sheet music she had brought, she said, "Please wait just a moment. I'll convey my feelings through music." After a brief, silent pause, a gentle melody flowed from her fingertips. It was a beautiful yet sorrowful piece. Not a familiar hymn, but a tune that seemed to hold both longing and warmth. When the performance ended, an unreadable moisture glistened in the pastor's eyes. Grace rose from her seat and cautiously approached him. "I felt like I couldn't express everything with words, so I just wanted to convey my feelings with what I do best. Grace, I can hear your heart so clearly, and I've decided to be a little more honest with you." The pastor came closer and gently took Grace's hand. It was trembling slightly. "I can no longer deny that I too have feelings that I haven't quite processed. Living as a pastor, perhaps I've confined myself out of guilt towards my late wife. But I've learned that if God allows me a new path, I need the courage to walk it." Grace looked at the pastor, her face on the verge of tears. He gently embraced her and said, "I can't think about marriage or anything like that right away. But I'd like it if we could open our hearts to each other and take things slowly." Grace nodded. That was enough. At least her sincerity hadn't been rejected, and she had confirmed that he, too, had opened his heart. After that, they cautiously began a relationship. Publicly, they were still pastor and accompanist, but they started sharing more private time and feelings. With such a significant age gap, many church members might not have noticed, but perhaps a few sensed that the two were growing quite close. Initially, Pastor Daniel was cautious, saying, "It's still too early to tell people the truth, and it could be hurtful to the congregation. This church is a small community, so I want to be discreet." Grace understood. Yet, They definitely had their moments alone. Sometimes, on a weekend afternoon when the church was empty, they would meet briefly for a simple meal or go for a drive to a nearby lake. Those short moments brought Grace incomparable happiness. The pastor also invited Grace to his home. Unlike the time she stayed because of the storm, this time she could go with a more relaxed heart. They watched movies together on the living room sofa, read old books together, and casually held and released each other's hands. Each time, Grace's heart would flutter, and yet, she found solace in that warmth. One time, then another, and gradually, the time spent at his house increased, eventually leading to Grace staying overnight at the pastor's house on several occasions. At this point, the pastor no longer kept his distance. It wasn't frequent at first, but they naturally began spending nights together in the same bed. Regardless of age or status, the attraction between a man and a woman was perfectly natural. Grace realized for the first time how warm it was to feel the body heat of someone she loved. And the pastor, while somewhat disoriented by the reawakening of forgotten emotions, also found comfort. After about a month or two of this, Grace started feeling unlike herself. At first, she thought it was just a minor health issue. But when her period was significantly late, she took a home pregnancy test. Just in case, the result was positive. Her mind went blank. What do I do? Fear and excitement washed over her simultaneously. That evening, Grace called the pastor with trembling hands. I need to talk to you. In person. It's important. Sensing something serious in Grace's voice, the pastor told her to come straight to his house. When Grace arrived and showed him the pregnancy test, the pastor stood there for a long time, silent and with a hardened expression. Grace saw both anxiety and a sense of responsibility flash across his face. So it's true, Grace. I'm sorry. I should have been more careful with you. You have your future, and I have my responsibilities. Was I too selfish? No. I'm an adult too. It was my choice, and you didn't force me. I actually think this child could be a blessing for us. The pastor covered his face with his hands. Then, seeming to compose himself, quietly pulled Grace into an embrace. It held apology and, at the same time, an intense affection. In that case, Grace, let's get married. I have to take responsibility. Don't say, responsibility. I truly love you too. Pastor, let's try to walk this path together. Wiping each other's tears, they decided to get married. How to tell the church and those around them. What to say to their parents. How to raise the child. A mountain of challenges lay ahead. But they believed they could overcome them if they were together. The Community Methodist Church in Cedar Rapids wasn't large, and they didn't want a grand, ostentatious ceremony. The news that the pastor, with a significant age difference, had fallen in love with a young university student was already beginning to spread within the local community. However, American culture tended to be more accepting of age differences. And most importantly, the congregation was surprisingly supportive of their pastor finding love and getting married. Pastor, you've been alone ever since your wife passed. You've finally found happiness. Grace, congratulations. Moving to a new town for school must have been tough. But it's good you've found a strong partner. Of course, there were some hushed whispers and concerned glances. But those closest to them were supportive. Particularly thoughtful church members would say, ultimately, isn't it a matter of love and faith? And actively cheered him on. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in the church chapel. A simple affair. Grace, in a neat and modest wedding dress instead of a flamboyant gown, and Pastor Daniel, in a simple suit, stood before the altar. An elder pastor from out of town officiated, and the congregants clapped joyfully, blessing the couple. Amidst the hymns that filled the chapel, Grace looked at the pastor and shed tears. The pastor, too, seemed deeply moved, gazing at Grace with a gentle smile. Then, the officiant's voice rang out, now, as you two accept each other as husband and wife and vow before God to be faithful to one another, I declare you married in the blessing of all congregants, family, and everyone gathered here. From the back, the quietly adorned piano began to play. It was a piece Grace had prepared herself. But since she couldn't play it, Another accompanist from the choir played it for her. The song was a gentle and joyful melody that Daniel and Grace had chosen together. Over that tune, countless congratulations and prayers poured down. It was a slightly unconventional pairing, a pastor and a university student, but in that space, it felt like a small heaven centered around the two of them. After the ceremony, a modest party was held in the church backyard. A spread of familiar American potluck fare, hamburgers, salad, potato salad, and some home-baked pies graced the tables, and people laughed brightly without awkwardness. Blessing the couple, the pastor held Grace's hand tightly and looked at the green trees in the distance. "I never imagined this day would come. I'm grateful, and while I feel sorry towards you, I'm truly happy. Me too, and you'll all bless our baby too. Right?" Grace gently caressed her belly. It wasn't noticeably showing yet, but the fact that a new life was growing inside her was overwhelming. Some congregants were surprised, but they soon offered heartfelt congratulations. She later learned that in the US, age differences weren't a huge deal. And more importantly, the culture was more open to blessing a couple's union, whether the pregnancy began before or after the wedding vows. Thanks to this atmosphere, Grace and the pastor could embark on their new beginning without a heavy burden. After the wedding, Grace moved in with her pastor husband. In reality, Grace had to juggle her school studies, church accompaniment, and housework until the baby's birth. But she felt more joy than hardship. The loneliness of her initial months in a new town, which had felt like darkness, now seemed to be turning into light. She could also focus on new ministries at the church, and Grace's presence brought positive energy to the congregants. People said Pastor Daniel became a much gentler and brighter person. The pain of losing his first wife didn't disappear, but walking through daily life with Grace allowed new healing in his heart. People rejoiced seeing this change in their pastor. Sometimes, people would still discreetly ask about the age difference between the pastor and Grace, but they would just laugh it off. "We're living well, aren't we? We believe God opened this path for us. That's right, we're just thankfully accepting the blessings given to us and doing our best to live accordingly." The sight of them attending services together, helping with church work together, and relying on each other at night as they became a family was like a heartwarming drama. When Grace was with the pastor, she felt as comfortable as if she were in a cozy cradle. And the child growing in her womb would one day bind them even more tightly. As the pregnancy progressed, not only the church members but also their neighbors encouraged them, saying the baby was a bundle of joy. Whenever Grace had free time and her body felt heavy, she would sit at the piano, recording or listening to prenatal music. Then, her pastor husband would sit beside her, reading a book and sharing quiet, warm stories for the baby to hear. This scene might seem ordinary to some, but for the two of them, it was a joy beyond words. Sometimes, the pastor would pray, murmuring to himself, "God, I don't know if I deserve to be this happy. Please give me the strength to protect this child and my wife." Each time, Grace would take his hand and reply, "We can be each other's strength. I feel secure because you're here, Pastor." People now referred to her simply as Grace, or sometimes, the pastor's wife, with affection. Small church events and prayers for the baby's blessing were held one after another. Grace sometimes felt like it was all a dream, that she had found a heart-pounding love and was even having a child in this new town. It was a completely different world from the one where she stood alone, trembling with fear at the bus station a few months ago. Ultimately, after a journey that felt long and distant, they received the great gifts of marriage, pregnancy, and a new family. It might be a difficult path in some ways, but if they could walk it relying on their love and trust for each other, and the grace given by God, there could be no greater blessing. The story ends here, but their future is just beginning. There might be hills so steep they seem hard to climb, but with their faith and sincere hearts for each other, they will overcome it all, and the little life growing in her womb will surely be accompanied by all the world's blessings. On the first Sunday after their wedding, Grace and Pastor Daniel sat quietly side by side during the service. The friendly greetings from congregants, The surprised reactions of acquaintances just learning of their marriage, and the soft murmurs of the church members, all became just pleasant background noise. After the service, Grace sat at the piano for a moment. Today, the pastor, wanting to show off his wife, had requested a special hymn and performance. The melody flowing from her fingertips spread gently, and the congregation held their breath, listening to the praise and music. In the midst of it, Grace prayed in her heart, "God, thank you for allowing me this life, with this man, who is no longer just my pastor but now my husband, and with this child, I will courageously live as you lead." When the performance ended, Pastor Daniel, now the husband she wanted to call more affectionately by his first name, Daniel, approached Grace and gently kissed the back of her hand. The church filled with small but warm cheers, and through their gazes, they shared a silent promise: our love is beginning like this. The baby soon to be born, and the future they would write together, was still unknown, but even that uncertainty became a beautiful anticipation. A small connection made during a lonely period in a new town. A memory of saving each other while sharing life and death through a natural disaster like a tornado, had ultimately led to such a brilliant fruition, and that fruition was continuing to blossom with unending hope and love. This was the fateful love story of a 20-something music student and a widowed Methodist pastor in a Midwestern town, a drama showing how a warm hand extended amidst what seemed like a bold, reckless challenge could create miracles, and a journey where earnest faith and respect sublimated into love, transcending people's expectations and prejudices, brightening each other's lives, and becoming a source of joy for one another. That was the path they chose to live.